The dynamic decade. Far-reaching changes in lifestyle and values paralleled a dramatic upsurge of the economy. The census of 1920 revealed that for the first time, most Americans no longer lived in the countryside, but in urban areas. Women continued to find opportunities for employment in the cities, though they tended to cluster in a few low-paying jobs that became classified as women's work. An organized birth control movement, led by the fiery feminist Margaret Sanger, openly championed the use of contraceptives. Alice Paul's National Women's Party began in 1923 to campaign for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. To some defenders of traditional ways, it seemed that the world had suddenly gone mad. Even the churches were affected. The fundamentalist champions of the old-time religion lost ground to the modernists, who liked to think of God was a good guy and that the universe was a pretty chummy place. Some churches tried to fight the devil with worldly champions, competing with joyriding automobiles and golf links. They turned to quality entertainment of their own, including wholesome moving pictures for young people. One uptown house of the Lord in New York advertised on a billboard, "Come to church, Christian worship increases your efficiency." Even before the war, one observer thought the chimes had struck 6 o'clock in America, and the 1920s witnessed what many old-timers regarded as a veritable erotic eruption. Advertisers exploited sexual allure to sell everything from soap to car tires. Once modest maidens now proclaimed their new freedom as flappers in bobbed dresses and tresses and dresses. Young women appeared with hemlines elevated, stockings rolled, breasts taped flat, cheeks roughed, and lips a crimson gash that held a dangling cigarette. Thus did the flappers symbolize a yearned for and devil-may-care independence in some American women. Still more adventuresome females stalked their elders when they sported the new one-piece bathing suits. Justification for this new sexual frankness could be found in the recently translated writings of Dr. Sigmund Freud. This Venetian physician appeared to argue that sexual repression was responsible for a variety of nervous and emotional ills. Thus, not pleasure alone, but also health demanded sexual gratification and liberation. Many taboos flew out the window as sex-conscious Americans let themselves go. As unknowing Freudians, teenagers pioneered the sexual frontiers. Glued together in rhythmic embrace, they danced to jazz music squeaking from phonographs. In an earlier day, a kiss had been the equivalent of a proposal of marriage. But in the new era, exploratory young folk sat in darkened movie houses or took to the highways and byways in automobiles. Their youthful neckers and petters poached upon the forbidden territory of each other's bodies. If the flapper was the goddess of the era of wonderful nonsense, jazz was its sacred music. With its virtuoso wanderings and tricky syncopation, jazz moved up from New Orleans along with the migrating blacks during World War I. Tunes like W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues became instant classics. At the wailing saxophone became the trumpet of the new era. Blacks such as Hardy, Jelly Roll Morton, and Joseph King Oliver gave birth to jazz, but the entertainment industry soon spawned all-white bands, notably Paul Whiteman's. Caucasian impressions cornered the prophets, though not the creative soul of America's most native music. A new racial pride also blossomed in the northern black communities that burgeoned during and after the war. Harlem in New York City, counting some 100,000 African American residents in the 1920s, was one of the largest black communities in the world. Harlem sustained a vibrant creative culture and nourished poets like Langston Hughes, whose first volume of verses, The Weary Blues, appeared in 1926. Harlem in the 1920s also spawned a charismatic political leader, Marcus Garvey. The Jamaican-born Garvey founded the United Negro Improvement Association to promote the resettlement of American blacks in their own African homeland. Within the United States, the UNIA sponsors stores and other businesses, like the Black Star Line Steamship Company, to keep blacks' dollars in black pockets. Most of Garvey's enterprises failed financially, and Garvey himself was convicted in 1927 for alleged mail fraud and deported by a nervous U.S. government. But the race pride that Garvey inspired among the 4 million blacks who counted themselves UNIA followers at the movement's height helped these newcomers in northern cities gain self-confidence and reliance, and his example proved important to the later founding of the Nation of Islam movement. Cultural liberation. Likewise in literature, an older era seemed to have ground to a halt with the recent war. By the dawn of the 1920s, most of the custodians of an aging genteel culture had died. Henry James in 1916, Henry Adams in 1918, and William Dean Howells in 1920. A few novelists who had been popular in previous decades continued to thrive, notably the well-to-do cosmopolitan New Yorker Edith Wharton and Virginia-born Willa Cather, esteemed for her stark but sympathetic portrayals of pioneering on the prairies. But in the decade after the war, a new generation of writers burst upon the scene. Many of them had hailed from the ethnic and regional backgrounds, different from that of the Protestant New Englanders who traditionally had dominated American cultural life. The newcomers exhibited the energy of youth, the ambition of excluded outsiders, and in many cases, the smoldering resentment of ideals betrayed. They bestowed on American literature new vitality, imaginativeness, and artistic quality. A patron saint of many young writers was H.L. Mencken, the bad boy of Baltimore. Little escaped his attic wit. In the pages of his green-covered monthly American Mercury, he wielded a slashing rapier as much as a pen. He assailed marriage, patriotism, democracy, prohibition, Rotarians, and the middle-class American. I'm not even going to say that shit. The South he contemptuously dismissed as the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, and he scathingly attacked do-gooders as Puritans. Puritanism he jibed, the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. The war had jolted many young writers out of their complacency about traditional values and literary standards. With their pens, they probed for new codes of morals and understanding, as well as fresh forms of expression. F. Scott Fitzgerald, a handsome Minnesota-born Princetonian, then only 24 years old, became an overnight celebrity when he published This Side of Paradise in 1920. The book became a kind of Bible for the young. It was eagerly devoured by aspiring flappers and their ardent wooers, many of whom affecting an air of bewildered abandon toward life. Catching the spirit of the hour, Fitzgerald found all good deed, all wars fought, all faiths and man shaken. He followed his melancholy success with The Great Gatsby, a brilliant commentary on the illusionary American ideal of the self-made man. Midwesterner James Gatz reinvented himself as Tycoon Jay Gatsby, only to be destroyed by the power of those while established wealth and social standing. Theodore Dreiser's masterpiece of 1925, An American Tragedy, similarly explored the pitfalls of social striving, as it dealt with the murder of a pregnant working girl by her socially ambitious young lover. Ernest Hemingway, who had seen action on the Italian front in 1917, was among the writers most affected by the war. He responded to the pernicious propaganda and the overblown appeal to patriotism by devising his own lean, word-sparring but word-perfect style, and The Sun Also Rises. He told the disillusioned, spiritually numb American expatriates in Europe, in A Farewell to Arms, he crafted one of the finest novels in any language about the war experience. A troubled soul, he finally blew out his brains with a shotgun blast in 1961. Other writers turned to a caustic probing of American small-town life. Sherwood Anderson dissected various fictional personalities in Winesburg, Ohio, finding them all in some way warped by the cramped psychological surroundings. Sinclair Lewis, a hot-headed, heavy-drinking journalist from Sauk Center, Minnesota, sprang into prominence in 1920 with Main Street, the story of one woman's unsuccessful war against provincialism. In Babbitt, he affectionately pillared George F. Babbitt, a prosperous, vulgar, middle-class real estate broker who slavishly conforms to the respectable materialism of his group. The word Babbitry was quickly coined to describe his all-too-familiar lifestyle. Hemingway, Anderson, and many other writers and painters found shelter in the inspiration of the Paris salon of Gertrude Stein, an expatriate American. A literary innovator in her own right, Stein wrote experimental poetry and prose, including Three Lives, Tender Buttons, and most famously, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. named for her lifelong partner. William Faulkner, a dark-eyed Mississippian, turned his attention to the fictional chronicle of an imaginary history-rich Deep South country. He named Yoknapatawpha in powerful books like The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying. Faulkner peeled back layers of time and consciousness from the constricted souls of his ingrown Southern characters. He extended meditation on the ragtag and bob ends of old tales and talkings, culminated in what some readers consider his greatest work, Absalom, Absalom. Nowhere was innovation in the 1920s more obvious than in poetry. Ezra Pound, a brilliantly erratic Idahoan who deserted America for Europe, rejected what he called an old bitch civilization gone in the teeth, and proclaimed his doctrine, make it new. Pound strongly influenced the Missouri-born and Harvard-educated T.S. Eliot, who took up residence in England. In The Wasteland, Eliot produced one of the most impenetrable but influential poems of the century. Robert Frost, a San Francisco-born poet, wrote hauntingly about his adopted New England. The most daringly and evocative was E. Cummings, who relied on unorthodox dictation and peculiar typesetting to produce startling poetical effects. On the stage, Eugene O'Neill, a New York dramatist and Princeton dropout of globe-trotting background, laid bare Freudian notations of sex in plays like Strange Interlude. A prodigious playwright, he authored more than a dozen productions in the 1920s and won the Nobel Prize in 1936. O'Neill arose from New York's Greenwich Village, which in after the war was a seething cauldron of writers, painters, musicians, actors, and other would-be artists. After the war, a black cultural renaissance also took root in Uptown Harlem, led by such gifted writers as Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston, and by jazz artists like Louis Armstrong and Ebu Blake. In an outpouring of creative expression called the Harlem Renaissance, they proudly exulted in their black culture and argued for a new Negro who was a full citizen and a social equal to whites. Architecture also reinnovated itself as modern in diverse ways. At one extreme, Frank Lloyd Wright advanced the theory that buildings should grow from their sites, incorporate indigenous materials, and not slavishly imitate Greek and Roman importations. In a very different kind of paean to modern America, the machine age outdid itself in New York City when it thrust upward the cloud-brushing Empire State Building, 102 stories high. Dedicated in 1931, the empty State Building towered partially vacant during the depressed 1930s. Wall Street's Big Bull Market. Signals abound that the economic joyride might end in a crash. Even in the best years of the 1920s, several hundred banks failed annually. This something for nothing craze was well illustrated by real estate speculation, especially the fantastic Florida boom that culminated in 1925. Numerous underwater lots were sold to eager purchasers for prosperous sums. The whole Wildcat scheme collapsed when the peninsula was devastated by a West Indian hurricane, which bellied advertisements of a soothing tropical wind. The stock exchange provided even greater sensation. Speculation ran wild, and an orgy of boom or bust trading pushed the market up to dizzy peaks. Never sell America short and be a bull on America were favorite catchwords. As Wall Street bulls gored one another and fleeced greedy lambs, the stock market became a veritable gambling den. As the 1920s lurched forward, everybody seemed to be buying stocks on margin, that is, with a small down payment. Barbers, stenographers, and elevator operators crashed in on hot tips picked up while on duty. One valet was reported to have parlayed his wages into $250,000. The cash register crashed the social register, as rags-rich Americans reverently worshipped at the altar of the ticker tape machine. So powerful was the intoxicant of quick profits that few heeded the voices raised in certain quarters to warn that this kind of tinsel prosperity could not last forever. Little was done by Washington to curb money-mad speculators. In the wartime days of Wilson, the national debt had rocketed from the 1914 figure of $1,188,235,400 to the 1921 peak of $23,976,250,608. Conservative principles of money management pointed to a diversion surplus funds to reduce this financial burden. A business-like move towards economic sanity was made in 1921 when a Republican Congress created the Bureau of the Budget. The Bureau's director was to assist the president in preparing careful estimates of receipts and expenditures for submission to Congress as the annual budget. This new reform, long overdue, was designed in part to prevent haphazardly extravagant appropriations. The burdensome taxes inherited from the war were especially distasteful to the Secretary of Treasury Mellon, as well as to his fellow millionaires. Their theory was that such high levies forced the rich to invest in tax-exempt securities rather than in the factories that provided prosperous payrolls. The Mellonites also argued that with considerable persuasiveness, the high taxes not only discouraged business, but in doing so, also brought a smaller net return to the Treasury than modern moderate taxes. Seeking to secure the poor and rich people, Mellon helped engineer a series of tax reductions from 1921 to 1926. Congress followed his lead by repealing the excess profit tax, abolishing the gift tax, and reducing excess taxes, the surtax, the income tax, and the estate taxes. In 1921, a wealthy person with an income of $1 million had paid $663,000 in income taxes. In 1926, the same person paid about $200,000. Secretary Mellon's spare the rich policies thus shifted much of the tax burden from the wealthy to the middle income groups. Mellon, lionized by conservatives as the greatest Secretary of Treasury since Hamilton, remains a controversial figure. True, he had reduced the national debt from $10 billion to about $26 billion to $16 billion, but foes of the emaciated multimillionaire charged that he should have bitten an even larger chunk out of the debt, especially while the country was pulsating with prosperity. He was also accused of indirectly encouraging the bull market. If he had absorbed more of the national income taxes, there would have been less money left for frenzied speculation. His refusal to do the typified and single-mindedly pro-business regime that dominated the political scene throughout the post-war decade.